Welcome to Chopping with Fire, where we bring you relevant experts in the topics of business, entrepreneurship, self-development, and of course, smart investments. Nominated by the People's Podcast Awards in 2022 and 2023 as one of the top business podcasts. Hosted by owner, doctor, and content creator Dustin Steffi. We are blessed to have our podcast in the top 50, paving the way in 5 major countries and counting, as well as money raised for 2 amazing causes, cystic fibrosis and of course the Boys and Girls Club. With that being said, and without further ado, let's chop it up. All right, everyone, we have Dr. Frank Cespedes joining us today with a little bit of background, and I'm not going to take the thunder from him. He is the author of 2 amazing books, which I think we will get into some of the topics in those today. One of those books is Sales Management That Works, and another book that he's written is Aligning Strategy in Sales. I think both of these books are awesome for my aspiring entrepreneurs or current entrepreneurs. So we're going to just dive right in. Frank, how are you?
I'm good. And Dustin, I want to thank you very much for hosting me. My pleasure to be here.
Well, I appreciate having you as well, too. I have a fond, soft spot for education and educators. So I'm pretty excited to have you on.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you don't have the attitude that those who can't do teach. That's a much more positive attitude.
I try. Sometimes my attitude isn't good, but for the most part it is. So tell me, Frank, I know a little bit about you, but my audience doesn't. Tell me a little bit about yourself.
My background is not terribly exotic, Dustin. I went to graduate school, got my degree, PhD in business, started teaching at Harvard's business school, made my way up the ladder there. After 10 years with some others, I left. We started a business, built that business. I ran it for 10 years, and then we got lucky. When need be, I can spin this a different way, but it was actually luck. We exited the business at exactly the right time. Harvard called me up again, said, how'd you like to be a professor again? And that's what I've been doing again for about the last 8 years. So it's academia, the real world, as they say, and then back in academia.
And for those of you that don't know, Harvard is an Ivy League school. Again, I believe in education firmly. I think Harvard is, in my opinion, a very, very quality education, especially with respect to business. I've read a lot of business reviews within Harvard, i.e. the Harvard Business Reviews. We read a lot of those. So again, very much so interested in what you have to offer today, Frank.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. What would you like to talk about?
Well, I think the big burning question that a lot of entrepreneurs have when they're starting, that is, all right, I have all these things going at once. I've got my license. I've started my business. I want to make money. I want to do everything. And they get pile driven, right? And then sometimes tunnel vision, in my opinion. So honestly, when it comes to business, I think we need to tackle what the hard things are, which some of the hard things include: how do you get the right talent to drive the business? How do you get customers into the door to actually sell the product or service that you have? And, or how do you even know where to start? You know what I mean? All questions that are insane. And for someone new that's starting business, it could be overwhelming. I'm not here to create a roadmap on how to start your business, but you and I both have experiences in being successful in business. And so I guess the question that we're going to head to is, how do we generate that success into business, whether it be with the right people and the right training or getting people in the door?
Yeah, well, I think you're making two important points. The first is the necessity for choice and priorities. One of the smartest things that I've heard anyone say about early stage ventures, startups, is from a fellow I know who's a very, very successful venture capitalist. I know there are a lot of entrepreneurs, they have an almost instinctive negative response to investors, but these are professional investors, and they are the source of billions and billions of dollars of startup capital in our economy. And what this person once told me is, startups don't starve, they drown. And what he was getting at is they don't starve, they don't tend to starve for lack of opportunity. Most entrepreneurs are actually pretty good at understanding a large untapped market opportunity. They don't starve, but they drown trying to do too many things at the same time. So I think the first comment I'd make is, remember that. And you've got to choose, you've got to prioritize not only what you do internally, but more importantly, what you do externally. And this is your second point, which I think is also right. Whatever else you prioritize, if you're in a for-profit business, you better prioritize getting paying customers. Now, I call that sales, but I don't much care what jargon we use for that. Marketing, sales, asparagus. At the end of the day, it's about demand generation and demand fulfillment. And, the books you mentioned are about that. They're about, how do you think about aligning your sales with your strategy? How do you think about issues like hiring and training and performance management? And we might talk about any one or more of those topics.
I guess before we dive into those topics, chronologically sitting here and looking at it, I just wanted to reinforce what you said, which is it is about one keyword, prioritizing. So what is the priority to enable success within the business that you're starting? So that's what I want everybody to keep in the back of their mind is, what is your priority? And you said it best. The priority is, if you're in a for-profit business, you need to make money. And so how do you make that money, especially in a world right now where we have social media, we have technology, we have so many levers that we can pull to market your service or good? How do we do that?
Yeah. Well, let's begin there, because I think there's a misunderstanding about what technology means, not only for entrepreneurs, but for businesses in general. And I'm going to cite a little data that may or may not surprise our listeners. But think about e-commerce. E-commerce is not new. It has been around for over 30 years. Just to give you a sense of its lineage, there was a company, books.com, that was selling books online nationally while Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, was still working on Wall Street. So this is not new. But if you ask yourself, what was e-commerce sales as a percentage of total retail sales in the United States just before the pandemic, the answer was about 11%. Now, when I ask that question of many executives, and I don't give them the number, and I say, what do you think it was? I routinely get estimates from 30 to 60%. In other words, many people are not a little bit out of touch with this core fact about buying. They are orders of magnitude out of touch. Now, what happened during the pandemic? Obviously, when stores are closed or held to 25 or 50% of their capacity, when people legitimately feel that if they walk into a store, they may catch a virus and bad things will happen, clearly there's going to be more buying and selling that occurs online. But if you look at the data, the high point of shutdown conditions in the United States so far, let's cross our fingers and hope for the best, but the high point so far was the second quarter of 2020. E-commerce as a percentage of retail sales in the second quarter of 2020, about 16%. In other words, it went up 5% even in those conditions. And it has come down since, and it seems to be stabilizing at about 15%. The point I want to make is this: it is not a digital eats physical world. The most important thing about selling in any business, startup or corporation, the most important thing about selling is the buyer. And the buyers are omnichannel buyers, to use the current jargon. They learn about you, your products, your services, both through salespeople and websites and influencers and a host of other ways. But it's not a digital eats physical world, it's an omni-channel world. So let me stop there for a second.
Yeah, so let me recap a couple things for a second too, just to keep people with us. So what you were saying is e-commerce sales hit a peak of about 15%, or no, hit a peak of about 16%, and that was during the pandemic in the second quarter of 2020. So with that being said, it started to normalize and stabilize right now at about 15% currently. To me, being business minded, that means that I have an 85% opportunity to increase some sales e-commerce wise, but I have to be smart in knowing who my customers are and the channels that they're using to market and be successful. That's what that tells me right now. Again, this is just my thoughts. Also, taking a look at it here, just so everybody knows, e-commerce has been around for quite some time. So you had already recapped it and said it's been around for about 30 years. And so this isn't a new concept. What is new within this right now is how people are using different levers within e-commerce to market, i.e. social media, i.e. their websites, whatever the case may be. But still, the tried and true way of marketing yourself out is what your own personal brand and image is, and what you put out into the world, and how that is put out, whether it be with your salespeople, whether it be with your website, etc. That's kind of where we're at right now. And then we ended at most consumers are omni-channel consumers.
Yeah, I think in general terms you've paraphrased it accurately, but I'd point out two things. I don't think the way to interpret it is because it's 15%, I can make it 100%. Buying for millennia has been both a social experience as well as an economic transaction. And a once-in-a-century pandemic is not going to change that. That's what you see in the numbers. Secondly, you're exactly right. What omni-channel means is that buyers learn about you many different ways, and conversely, you have many different levers you can pull for business development. But here's the important thing, and this what I'm about to say was indeed accelerated by the pandemic. Approaching companies, let me broaden it, not just through a website, but digitally, social media, all the other things you're talking about. What the pandemic did was make that very, very expensive, all right? As we speak, there is a joke that marketing people in Silicon Valley are telling each other. And the joke is, where is the best place to bury a body? And the answer is page 2 of any search engine, because nobody goes there, right? That's where we're going to find, Jimmy Hoffa. So that route is increasingly expensive. And frankly, it is a classic example of what an economist would call the law of diminishing returns. Again, I want to get back to my original point. It is not a digital eats physical world, but it is a world where buyers and sellers now, out of necessity, must communicate with each other through multiple ways. And the salesperson is not dead. There are, the number of salespeople in the United States has increased steadily in the 21st century, even as the internet has diffused and more people get it and more people have broadband. So old-time selling is not dead. It continues to live alongside these newer media.
Let's talk about your book, Aligning Strategy and Sales, because we're kind of heading that way anyway. We'll talk about that book first. So in short, like if I were just person who hasn't read it and I'm looking at that title, I'm looking at Aligning Strategy and Sales. So I'm looking at what strategies can I implement to gain more sales, essentially, correct?
That, but it also works the other way. If I have a strategy, how do I make sure that the enormous amount of money that companies devote to sales is aligned with that strategy, as opposed to, stuff that really doesn't increase the value of the enterprise?
So then we're talking about change management in a sense, and the ability to change with the changing environment.
Yeah. That's almost always part of any business, almost always part of both strategy and sales, for a very important reason that book talks about at some length. Value in any business is created or destroyed out there in the marketplace. It's not created or destroyed in your mind. It's not created or destroyed in meetings. It's created or destroyed in exchanges with prospects and customers. And the market has no responsibility to be nice to any company's strategy. It is the responsibility of the company to adapt to the realities of the market. And that does mean change. And the pace of change has accelerated for some of the technology reasons, among others, that we were just describing.
And so in my mind and in my studies too, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, I know I'm not perfect, but I do have a sense of this. I think the biggest pitfall an entrepreneur or a business, we'll just keep it broad, a business falls into in general, is not being able to keep up with the changing landscape of the environment that they're in. So I think that most businesses that I've seen that have not succeeded, not succeeded, is because their strategy isn't there to implement for the changing environment, in my mind. Also, I feel as if when we look at strategy in general, some people and some businesses don't have a strategy. And so therefore that also plays a part in failure of businesses.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. And I think you're quite right to distinguish those causes, because while they're linked, they're separate. On the change area, I think you're exactly right. I think partly it's human nature, right? We don't like change. But in any market, when the pace of change in the market outruns the pace of change in the enterprise, you're going to run into problems sooner or later. But then there is the necessity, if you're going to respond productively, as opposed to simply reactively and ad hoc, you need a strategy. And the reality is that most companies, not some, but most companies and most ventures don't have a strategy. right? They have a goal. They may have what we now call a purpose or a mission. They may have values. All of that is important, but it's not the same as a strategy. I probably, I don't have to be humble about this, because of the research I've done, the company I ran. I've worked with lots and lots of companies. I've probably been part of as many strategy meetings as anybody. And the reality, when you cut through the rhetoric, most companies, when they say strategy, are basically saying, let's pick a big number and go for it. And unfortunately, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So I agree with you entirely, Dustin. I think you're exactly right. The responsibility for change rests with the seller, not the buyer. But in order to make productive change, it's important to have a strategy and not confuse that strategy with slogans or purpose or mission statements, etc.
So piggybacking off of that, and I think this is a great relevant question, especially to ask you, those strategy meetings that you were a part of and strategy in general, in my mind, it should be living and breathing, right? So strategy isn't just sit down for a meeting for one time for the year and then hope for the best. You're sitting down constantly, and that strategy should be evolving, correct?
Yes, it should. I'd make 2 points about this. And this, by the way, is very often, the situation I'm about to describe is very often why entrepreneurs have an opportunity. But again, you'll see the data in the book you mentioned. But if you look at big companies, the so-called Fortune 500, what you see in many of those companies is first a confusion between a strategy meeting and the annual capital budgeting meeting. The capital budgets are important, forecasts are important, but they're not the same as a strategy. Strategy is about the choices we make. What markets and segments do we and don't we serve? Do we have an advantage in those markets where we choose to serve? What are the implications for hiring, training, capital expenditures, etc.? That's different than simply setting a budget. And secondly, at big companies, what the data tells us is that it's now between 6 and 8 months that those companies spend in their so-called annual strategic planning process. Now, notice this, 6 months. During that period of time, the market will do whatever the market's going to do. So even if that company comes up with a great strategy, it may be obsolete in market time. That's where, if you're a more flexible early stage venture entrepreneur, you can and should have an advantage, but you still have the same challenge. You still have to come up with a market relevant strategy. And in terms of living it every day, when a company really has a strategy, most people in the company should be able to tell you what that strategy is in 50 words or less. The core components of any strategy are A, what are our objectives with this market or segment? B, what is our market or segment? What in business schools we call scope. And then C, in the markets and segments where we choose to compete, what is the source of our advantage? That shouldn't take more than 50 words to articulate. The details behind that may indeed take more than 50 words, but everybody in the company should be able to sort of recite objective, scope, advantage.
So I'm going to simplify this for our listeners. We just got done talking about a very important topic when it comes to entrepreneurship and business, and that is having an appropriate strategy in order to be successful as a company or venture. The biggest takeaway that I have for this is everybody that is a part of that company or venture should be able to identify what the objectives are, what the scope is, which is business term, and what the source of development is in 50 words or less, or as we would call it in an elevator pitch, like pretty simplistic.
I think that's right.
Yeah. And then
By the way,
obviously,
let me point out something about this, because I think it's an inhibition both for big companies and many entrepreneurs. Again, you can see this in the book you mentioned, but if you look at the data about this, the vast majority of organizations are not just poor at communicating their strategy to their people, they are terrible at it. There's a company called Effectory that actually, for over 25 years, sends out a fabulous survey annually, crosses industries, up and down the hierarchy. And one of the questions that they ask every year of employees is, quote, do you understand your firm's strategy? Fair, right? I think we can agree it's tougher for people to do things they don't understand. The results are pretty consistent. Less than 50% of the respondents say, I do, which means more than 50% are saying, I really don't have a clue. But here's the really interesting part. The Effectory database is very good. You can slice it many ways. The closer you get to the customer, in other words, when you look at the responses of people in sales and service, the percentage of employees who say, I understand my company's strategy goes down. It doesn't go up, right? Now, when you ask CEOs or entrepreneurs, how come you're so bad at communicating strategy? By far the most common response, in my experience, is that they say, well, we don't want to talk about it too much. We're afraid that our competitors will find out. And I always say the same thing to the founder or the CEO. Let's get real. You have much bigger problems than your competitors finding out about your strategy if your own people don't understand the strategy. It's a very bogus response, but it's one of the reasons that companies are bad. And notice the implication, again, especially if you're an entrepreneur. If you can get just a little bit better at this core element of management and leadership, you've got an advantage. That's what the research will tell you.
So if this information has piqued my listeners' interest, again, we were just taking a few snippets out of the Aligning Strategy and Sales book, which again, I think has very relevant information in. I think it has good data. If you want to pick that up, I would definitely pick that up and give it a read so you can get some ideas from that book and just be able to implement some strategies within that. I want to shift gears because I want to give equal amount of time to the other book that you've written, which is Sales Management That Works.
Okay. That's a book that is more tactical than the first book you mentioned. It's about really the core elements in sales management, business development, including hiring, training, performance reviews, and so on. Your listeners might find it interesting, why I wrote the book. And the reason is the following. Of all the various functions in business, sales is by far the most context specific. In other words, selling software is different than selling durables, is different than selling professional services, etc. It also differs not only depending upon what you're selling, but to whom and where you sell. Selling in the United States is very different than selling in Latin America or Asia or the Middle East, etc. Right? So it's also a culturally contextual activity. And yet, for some reason, sales is that area of business where so many pundits feel comfortable making these huge generalizations that are usually unsupported by any data whatsoever beyond what in academia we would call N equals 1. When I sold for Oracle 15 years ago, this is what worked for me. I'm sure it'll work for you. So, after doing 30 years of what I think is reasonable research in this area, I wanted to write a book that says, look, this is what research does and does not tell you about this core activity in business. And once I point that out to folks, how context specific sales is, they tend to nod, but it really has been striking to me how many smart, well-educated people forget that. And it's a bit of a mystery because it's the one area where everybody feels they can generalize about the activity, and generalizations are risky in this area.
I think a good example of that is the company that I was working for had many different cultures within it, right? And if you didn't have an understanding of how to approach business, with each of the different cultures, then you were not successful. So a good example of this is we talk about like the Indian culture, which I mean, that's very broad. So I'll narrow it in. So like the Punjabi culture, right? They're very into making money. And so one way of being able to communicate with them specifically is to be able to talk about the very analytical way of how to run their business appropriately to create and generate that success. And then other things that dive into culture is like accepting gifts from them. If you do not, and you didn't know that, like it's kind of a slap in their face. So just knowing different things, what I'm trying to get at is knowing different things helps to create and generate success. Not one size, not one shoe fits everything.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's culturally specific. I'm not sure Punjabi is in any sense different in terms of making money. I've yet to meet a good salesperson who tells his customers, buy from me because you won't make money. But I think your larger point is correct. But it's not just that. Let's stick with the United States. Depending on what you're selling and what kind of buyer you're dealing with, the recipe for success varies quite significantly.
Definitely. And again, I think for the Sales Management That Works book, there's significant details in there, probably a lot of data as well to show and illustrate this, correct?
Yeah, that's right. And we might talk about the hiring part. Because it's one of the big decisions that any entrepreneur makes, right? When you do look to hire someone who's going to be your business developer, or maybe even build your business development team, that's a big deal. Think about software startups. If you look at software startups, once they've developed most of their product, by far the biggest ongoing operating expense and the biggest determinant of what, in entrepreneurial circles we call burn rate, right? Burning the cash you have available. By far the biggest determinant of that is sales and the selling cycle. It's directly correlated with time to cash, working capital and funding needs, and so forth. So it's a big deal, and it's a very tough decision. I'll just throw out a little data about this that the listeners might find useful. There are challenges in hiring salespeople that simply don't exist to the same extent in any other business function. I'll give you an example. If you look to hire someone in finance or accounting, You can go to a college or university and you can find people who majored in those topics, right? If you want to hire an engineer, you can go to a school, and it's a little bit like walking into a food court. What kind of engineer are you interested in? Electrical engineering, etc. Same is true for programmers. But the last time I looked, which was, about 3.5 years ago when I started writing this book, of the more than 4,000 colleges and universities in the United States, less than 300 even offered a sales course, let alone a sales program. So this is a core area of business where the majority of people start out knowing very, very little about what they're going to get paid for. And that leads to the second fact that I'll mention. Companies already spend a ton of money on sales and sales training. On average, companies spend 20% more per capita, per person, on sales training than any other business function. But the return on that investment is notoriously disappointing. And it's disappointing for some systemic reasons that we can talk about, but if that's helpful. So this is a big decision for any company, but especially if you're in an entrepreneurial early stage company.
See, the biggest thing that I took from that is, and I can be one to tell you, I am completely business for all of my degrees, correct? And not one class was offered for sales in general. All of my selling experience has been with the many different companies that I've been a part of, and that investment that each of those companies had put in to upscale me and my knowledge on sales, whether it be social styles, whether it be understanding how to even approach or talk to different people. Like, those are things that were not learned at a university level. They were learned within the many companies that I've been a part of that have made that investment. Where it's pretty daunting to me right now is, you said they spend about 20% per capita, but the statistic that interested me the most was the return on investment part, because you were saying that the return on investment of these investments that the companies are making is not as lucrative as one would think it would be.
Yeah. And we might talk about some of the reasons for that. I mean, and they're pretty systematic. One is, and I say this as an educator, but there's an over-reliance on classroom training in sales. Sales is a performance art. It's about behaviors. It's about what people say or don't say. Training is important, but talking about selling is not the same thing as selling. All right, there's a classic amount of on-the-job learning here. The second thing is, you've got to understand some of the basics about adult learning. What I'm about to say applies to other functions, but sales is in some sense exhibit A for this. Salespeople are not studying for the final exam in my course or the training seminar. That is not how adult learning works. Adults, and salespeople in particular, tend to pay attention to information when and where they need it, not weeks or months earlier in a seminar. And by the way, this is an area, this is called just-in-time learning. This is an area where the new technologies can help, because now it is very, very feasible, and in fact, increasingly inexpensive, to get that information to salespeople when they want it, on their way to make a call or during the actual sales conversation via the phone, the iPad, etc. The third element here is what the learning people call modeling behavior. The way people in sales learn the most is not from a professor. They learn some, I hope. Not from a trainer. Again, they learn some. but they learn the most from the best of their peers. That's what modeling behavior means. In other words, I watch someone who's a colleague do this well, and I say, the way you dealt with that price objection, that was clever. I'm going to use that. The way you framed that value proposition, I hadn't thought of it that way. And again, this is both a management, but also a leadership issue where technology can help. Part of what you want to do is accelerate that best practice learning. And again, technology can help with this. So there are systematic reasons why the return on that very, very big investment is disappointing, but there are also systematic things that smart managers can do to make that ROI better than it is. But again, it's a little bit like our public school system. The issue is not, are we spending a lot of money on training in this area? We are. The issue is how we spend it.
I think another thing to bring up, and you can correct me if I'm wrong because you definitely have more experience than I do, is not only how one learns or is able to learn, because I'm going to be honest with you, being inundated by PowerPoints to learn isn't for me, right? I'm more of the hands-on, like, do it and then it sticks, right? But the other thing to note, in my opinion, is the ability to have a manager that's able to reinforce some of the key things that were learned and that are important. I think, and again, this is just based off my experience, I think what happens usually is companies invest in training, they train their workforce, but then after that training, it's kind of like put away, right? It's not reinforced, it's not brought back up. There's no checkpoints, there's no reminders, there's no accountability, I guess would be the best word to use, unless you have a different one, but there's no real accountability or knowledge checks to see where the sales force is to reinforce this, to make that return on investment better.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And again, I'd emphasize two things you're saying. Look, one thing we know for a fact is that different people learn in very, very different ways. So don't generalize. I happen to share your distaste for the PowerPoint parade, but believe it or not, Dustin, there are people that actually learn that way. There are other people that learn by reading, by narrative. And then there are other people for whom a picture is worth not just 1,000 words, but 10 or 20,000 words. So, you just got to be open to those different learning styles. But again, technology allows us to approach people through these multiple ways. The second part, though, is exactly what you're talking about, follow-up. And in business and in sales in particular, probably the most important form of follow-up is the performance review. And this is, in my experience, the most underutilized lever for affecting behavior in most organizations. And if I can be blunt, the biggest offenders here, in my experience, do tend to be entrepreneurs. And they shouldn't be. This is a trainable skill. So much, let's get back to what we were talking about earlier in this conversation, the market, buyers, change. So much of the really important information about buying and buyers in any market is not in the CRM system. It's in the brain, we hope, of the salesperson. And that information only becomes visible through a performance conversation. So notice, when managers don't engage in this activity, not only are they encouraging a culture of underperformance, right? Most people, look, if nobody's talking to me about this, I must be doing it right, even if they're not. But they not only perpetuate a culture of underperformance, they also inhibit the flow of vital information in the business. And again, the business I ran, it was 4 years before I brought in someone. She was a wonderful retired senior HR executive, someone I brought in to help train us on how to do this better. And it's a very, very trainable skill. There's no excuse, in my opinion, for not engaging in that kind of follow-up.
Now that we whet the listeners' appetites a little bit, I do want to make a couple reminders. One, I will have links to these books because I think that there is a wealth of knowledge, more than a wealth of knowledge in both of these books. So again, both the books are Aligning Strategy and Sales, and then the other book is Sales Management That Works. I will have links in the episode description. I suggest and highly encourage you to pick those books up and give them a read, because this is just hitting the tip of the iceberg with the wealth of knowledge that you've already offered today, Frank. Too, I wanted to take this time to just thank you for like coming in and really just like giving that little bit of a right? That little push on like really changing the mindset a little bit and really just kind of diving in to where the opportunity areas are to really create the success when it comes to running your business, whether you be an entrepreneur or whether you be a Fortune 500 company for that matter. So I really do appreciate that.
Well, Dustin, flattery will get you everywhere with me. And I appreciate you hosting me and the very, very nice and kind things you said about me and the books. I obviously appreciate that as well.
Again, guys, if you haven't done so already, I would take a listen to this episode, maybe listen a few times, take a look at those books. Again, they are amazing books that are going to give you more information than what we gave you today. Frank, last thing that I want to give you, because I think it'll be fun. If you had one key piece of information to give to all the listeners, so just pretend it's your class right now, what is the most important piece of information that you want to have as a message today for everyone?
Well, there's we've been talking about books. Let me cite a book. I don't know if you or any of our listeners, the author John le Carre. John le Carre wrote the spy novels for so many years. I think he passed away last year. But in one of his books, one of his characters says something that I think everybody in business, they should have this tattooed to some prominent body part. The character says, a desk, this is what he says, a desk is a dangerous place from which to watch the world. And that's true, all right? Again, I'll get back to what I said at the beginning. Value is created or destroyed out there, all right? And especially in a world where we are flooded with data, there are people who I think, and again, data is good. Data helps us bound the uncertainties, but it's a fallacy to believe that you can manage any business from the spreadsheet or simply from the database. And I don't care how big that database is. A desk is a dangerous place from which to view the world. You don't have to be a great salesperson if you want to be an entrepreneur, but you have to enjoy customer contact. You have to invite it and encourage it, not discourage it. I guess that would be my final comment, Dustin.
Frank, again, wealth of knowledge, lots of knowledge bombs dropped today. I really can't thank you enough for coming on. I appreciate you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you again for choosing Chopping with Fire as your premier podcast for anything with regards to business, entrepreneurship, self-development, and smart investment decisions. If you enjoyed the episode as much as we did, please head on over to one of our social platforms and leave us a comment and or add us. We do have a TikTok. We do have a LinkedIn. We have a Facebook, Instagram, YouTube as well. And also we do have a website. Head on over to www.choppingwithfire.com. That's CHOPPIN with fire.com. and take a look at prior content that we have posted. Lastly, if you guys can, please head on over to your favorite podcast platform and leave us a 5-star rating and review. We love to interact with our fans, and I would love to post responses to your guys' comments. Again, this was another episode of Chopping with Fire.